Are. Thank you for joining today's webinar on verification and professional judgment. My name is Manuel Talavera. I'm a professional development specialist here at the Illinois Student Assistance Commission, ISAC. So before I go over the content of the presentation, I do have some housekeeping items. So the session is already been recording. You may have already heard WebEx's voice letting you know. I did not include it on here, but we are offering CE and PD credits. So wait until the end of the webinar. We'll share you a link where you can access that survey. Just as a reference, if you are requesting PD hours, we do need your EIN. So when you complete the evaluation, please include your EIN. If you are having trouble hearing me, you can connect via connecting audio through your computer using the call me option. And so WebEx can call you in directly on your cell phone. We also have Q&A open here, being joined by some of my colleagues up here as panelists. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them on there. You will not be able to unmute yourself or come on video. So if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So for those who don't know about ISAC, so we're the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. I like to think of ourselves as the largest one-stop resource for financial aid information here in the state of Illinois. Our mission is to provide Illinois students with information and assistance to help make education beyond high school more accessible and affordable. We also administer scholarships and grants across the state, such as the Monetary Award Program, the MAP grant, which is one of the largest grant programs of its kind in the country. In our division of college access and outreach, we also host a wide variety of different professional development offerings, such as on various topics, such as navigating financial aid process, resources for supporting underrepresented students, on loan repayment and forgiveness programs, etc. If there's any topic that has to do with financial aid, chances are we've done a topic on it or we'll do a topic on it. So this is a breakdown of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about sort of what comes next after your student submits a FAFSA. We're going to talk a little bit about the direct data exchange or DDX and making corrections. Talk a little bit about verification, then we'll get into professional judgment, appeals, and have some resources for you all to share. So with that, I'll get started. So when a FAFSA gets submitted, it goes to the FAFSA processing system, formerly known as the Central Processing System. So this was one of the new changes with the new FAFSA. So we have the FAFSA processing system now, FPS. So with this, when a student submits a FAFSA, two things happen, right? Well, several things happen, but two output documents get generated. So one of them is the FAFSA submission summary, so that goes to the student, and the other is the ISER, the Institutional Student Information Record, and that goes to the institution. So the institution uses the information on the ISER, which is laid out a bit differently from the FAFSA submission summary, to package a financial aid offer for the student. So with what's happening, the FAFSA processing system, it is calculating an SAI for the student, which is going to be the same for the FAFSA submission summary and for the ISER. It is also, which for those who have been in financial aid for a while, the FAFSA submission summary replaces the student aid report, the SAR, the SAR. So the SAR is now FAFSA submission summary. But it also checks the FAFSA for any inconsistencies and mistakes. It can select a FAFSA for verification. So it's really important that when a student completes a FAFSA on the web, the FAFSA completes their FAFSA on the web because it does process much faster. So if a student is submitting a paper FAFSA, it goes to a FAFSA processor and then it goes to the FAFSA processing system. So it does take a little bit of extra time for that. And also, of course, some data matching happening, which I'll go over in the next slide. So with the FAFSA process system, the data matching, so what's happening here is I like to think about this as the tinted window where you can see out, but those can see in. So it's not a two-way communication. So for example, when FSA, Federal Student Aid, is looking to match the student's social security number with their name and date of birth, that's already happened with the student's FSA ID creation. So that piece has already been taken care of. But you may have a student who is an eligible, is a non-US citizen, but they're eligible, or non-eligible US citizen, or eligible non-US citizen. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue twisted here. So the thing to note here is that SSA doesn't know what FSA is kind of doing. They have an agreement in place to know that they can data share, but there's no two-way communication to it, and that's to protect the identity of the student. So with Department of Homeland Security, they're checking the student's non-citizen, their eligible non-citizen status. So student provides their alien, registration number, the ARN. That's included on there for the National Student Loan Database System, or NSLDS. They're looking at the federal student loans in default, or if they're in over payment, meaning they've received more than what they were eligible for. And then Department of Veteran Affairs, or VA, they're checking the student's veteran status. So when a student submits a FAFSA, updates and corrections can be made online regardless of how the FAFSA was submitted. And even though updates and corrections lead to essentially the same thing, a change into the FAFSA, a new transaction that a college can see, like, oh, what was the old information? What's the new information now? FSA does kind of denote the difference between the two, not to be splitting hairs, but an update is something where it was already correct at the time you've submitted that information, but it's no longer true now. Like for example, maybe at the time you reported a certain amount of income, but maybe a parent lost their job or took a demotion, or maybe they're working a lot of overtime and now they're not. Any scenario you can think of in that situation. That's what's referred to as an update. Or a student getting married, right? At the time they submitted their FAFSA, they were single, but now they're not. A correction, on the other hand, is a mistake that a student, when they submitted their FAFSA, they included a mistake and they went back to correct it, such as including the home in which you live in as an asset, which for FAFSA purposes is not considered an asset. So a student may have submitted that, went back and removed that as the correction. So what you can do is, I always tell students all the time, especially with this tumultuous FAFSA release of this year, which seems to have no end in sight, but we still have to hang in there. You want to make sure students are checking the status of their submitted FAFSA. And this is always the case. Students may say, oh, I've submitted it. You go back and, well, I checked gap access, but I don't see the student aid index. So let's go back to see what happened. They may be missing a signature or may have gotten everything, but just didn't hit submit. So you want to make sure that gets submitted. If they need to make any corrections or updates, they should do so. Oftentimes in their FAFSA submission summary, they will get notified of any corrections or what items they've been verified, what mistakes have been found, what steps the students need to do to correct them. So definitely have a student follow those steps. And they can view and print their FAFSA submission summary and see all that information that they self-reported on the FAFSA. So a little bit more about the FAFSA submission summary. So this documents the students' basic information about their eligibility for federal student aid and their student aid index. So since this is a federal form, state financial aid programs and institutional aid will not be included on here. So this is not a financial aid offer. These are estimated information. A lot of times maybe a student still needs to submit additional documentation, or they submitted their FAFSA and they still have some things that are missing. Maybe they used estimates, tax information, etc. So it's something to kind of pay attention to. And most of those programs, like such as state, federal, financial, like the MAP grant or institutional monies, they're going to be on the student's package. So when they see their financial aid offer, all that money would be included on there if they're eligible for it. Otherwise, this is a federal form. They're just going to see federal eligibility for the programs on there. So it's going to include information that they self-report on the FAFSA. So students are going to receive it via email and can access it on studentaid.gov once their FAFSA has been processed. So the backlog has been cleared, so students are receiving their federal their FAFSA submission summaries rather as processed as normal. But in the past, it was taking a few weeks. Actually, they weren't being processed at all after students submitted it successfully in January up until recently, early April, late March, as they started as federal student aid started releasing them in batches. But now those are being processed as usual, and as well as corrections, which I'll go over a little bit more. So with the FAFSA submission summary, so this is a screenshot of what looks like the paper version. So what you'll see here is a student will see their data release number, which is the DRN, and it's useful for locating the student's FAFSA form. So if you're working with the student and a high school student and have a question on their FAFSA, it's best to have the DRN ready so that they can reach out and have that information. So just to make sure there are no mistakes. You'll see their student aid index, their SAI, which replaces the EFC, the expected family contribution. So in this specific example, you'll see that these are all zeros. It can be as negative 1500. You also see an asterisk, which indicates the student's been selected for verification, as well as the letter C, which there are a lot of different corresponding letters that mean something else. In this specific example, the C indicates that there's an eligibility issue. It also indicates the date that this form, that the FAFSA was received, as well as their application status. So if there's any corrections, like in a specific example, as I mentioned, there's an asterisk in the student's SAI, indication that they're going to get verified, but they also will see language that they've been selected for verification. They just won't be left guessing, like, I don't know, I got this asterisk, did I win something, right? But here it'll tell them what they've been verified for, and then later on in the form it'll indicate you were selected for these specific items. These are the steps you need to do to solve that verification, right? To satisfy that verification. So I wanted to also include some FAFSA submission summary statuses, especially in lieu of what's been going on with the FAFSA. And Department of Education laid out these definitions. So if you go to your FAFSA, studentaid.gov, you log into My Activity, you can see the status of your FAFSA. It should say any one of these. Draft, meaning the student hasn't completed their FAFSA, it's still incomplete. In progress, so the student provided consent and approval and signature to their section of the FAFSA, but the form hasn't been submitted yet. In review, the FAFSA has been submitted, but it is still processing. A FAFSA that is processed, this is what we want to see. The FAFSA form was processed successfully and no further action is required. And if there indicates that action is required, maybe a student still needs to provide a signature from one of their contributors. Or in some cases, they may need to reach out to their financial aid office to resolve some of those issues. And so that's all going to be dependent on whatever's going on with the student, especially if they have a special or unique circumstance, which I'll go over later on in this presentation. And then lastly, closed if FAFSA form was never submitted and can no longer be submitted because the federal FAFSA deadline is passed. So keep in mind the deadline for this year's FAFSA is not until the end of next June. So you still have a long time. So with the ISER, the Institutional Student Information Record, so again, this gets sent to the institutions that the student listed on their FAFSA. So they can always go back in and add more colleges. It's not going to impact the schools that they've already listed, even if they remove them to add more schools. But this is going to provide very similar information to the FAFSA submission summary, but it also contains information that institutions need to package a financial aid offer for the student. Also to include other information, such as the institution may say, oh, this student's family, they live in Illinois, they may be eligible for the MAP grant. Let's run the SAI. Oh, they are eligible for the MAP grant, so they know to put the MAP grant in, and as long as the institution is MAP grant eligible, right, we'll include that in their financial aid offer. So that's why we always say that FAFSA submission summaries, that's not a financial aid offer. Just gives them an idea what they're going to receive from the federal government. If there is any issues, they'll also indicate that if an SAI was not calculated or if it was rejected, so institutions will see that information. And from there, they can follow up with the student saying, hey, we got your FAFSA, but these are some issues. These are the things a good financial aid office will tell the student that these are the things you need to do to correct those issues moving forward. Now I'm going to go over a little bit about direct data exchange or making corrections. So we're using the acronyms DDX for direct data exchange. So if you see that is what I'm referring to. So DDX and federal tax information, so FTI. So if you see that acronym in the slide, that's what I'm referring to. So the new DDX process requires that all contributors must provide consent to allow for their federal tax information to be transferred from the IRS. This is replacing the IRS data retrieval tool, the DRT, right? So the DDX is the new DRT, right? Data retrieval tool. So it's not a DDX because that's going to happen automatically. And it's going to include more information. So if you're working with a family and their tax filing status is married, filed jointly, then only one parent needs to provide consent. But then if you're in a situation where your parents are students' parents, biological parents are living together but not married, or they filed married but separate returns, then both parents will need to provide consent in those situations. And this process is also open to those who did not file taxes. So this is new. In the past, students and parents had to submit additionally a verification of non-filing. And what this indicates is that the IRS doesn't have a tax file of that individual on file. And so you may still have a student happening with that may happen with that, but the IRS will indicate to that, hey, we've tried to see if they have a tax return on file, they don't, right? So that removes that additional burden. And we did have a lot of families, especially lower income families, that had to do that. So, and then if a student or parent is unable to use the direct data exchange, they will have to manually enter their tax information. So why is this whole thing important, right? And I have a screenshot of the consent box because both students and parents will see the same thing. It's important because every contributor, student being the main contributor, must provide consent. And contributors follow definitions of who is a parent for purposes of the FAFSA. In some cases, you may have a situation in which the student is providing contributor information from a parent from which they don't live with, especially if they're, and that's specifically for students who are part of divorced family households. So it goes by whose parent provides the most financial support in that 12 months. So it could be another, maybe their parent, mom or dad, depending on who they're living with, or so pay attention to that when you're working with students. A lot of times they don't tell you what's going on until you kind of hear and you're asking them questions. So oftentimes when I'm in a financial aid application workshop, I tell parents and students like, hey, I'm going to ask you a lot of personal questions, not because I want to know your business. It's because I need this information to better assist you. Oftentimes, when you meet someone for the first time, even professionally or personally, you don't ask them, hey, what's your tax filing status? How many people live in your household? How much money did you earn, right? Those are very personal questions. So I like to preface that and let them know that I'm asking these questions for a purpose, right? So I can better assist you. And so when I was mentioning about consent and why it's important to do so, because if a student does not provide consent or a parent doesn't provide consent, especially the student's SAI, the student index, will not be calculated. So a student will not know their eligibility for financial aid. That's what it's going to come down to. So a student will then be required to manually import information. So when they're manually importing information, they're going to get selected for verification. And I know we're not talking about verification yet, but students who use direct data exchange aren't required to go through verification because that information came directly from the IRS. So when it comes to updates and corrections, so students are able to make corrections to their FAFSA once it's been processed. I know for a while now, even though their FAFSA was submitted, they weren't able to go in and make corrections, or even when their FAFSA was processed, they weren't able to make corrections on it or updates. So that process is fully open now. There may still be some glitches, which I have a slide in our resources section, which I'll talk a little bit about. But just know that that can still happen, right? There's still some open issues out there. So any corrections and updates can be made online regardless of how the FAFSA was submitted, as long as it's been processed. So students can make changes in one of the following ways. They can make changes to their paper FAFSA submission summary. So if they submitted a paper version, they will get an email, or they get their FAFSA submission summary in the mail, and they can make corrections on that. They can also make the corrections online. So if a student submitted a paper version and they haven't created their FSA ID, they need to go in and create an FSA ID that's going to get matched with their FAFSA. So once they get their FAFSA information, they'll need to log in and go to account dashboard to make changes, or they can do so in person at the financial aid office. So the institution is part of the FAFSA partner portal, or they can make it on their mainframe system as well. And when they do that, it makes a change that's reflective in all the students' FAFSAs for the ones that were sent to the other students' institutions, especially if they're, incoming freshmen, they're still shopping around, they still don't know which institution they want to go to, they're waiting on their financial aid offers. That is something that's beneficial for the student, because then that's updates going to happen across the board, not just for their institution. And when it comes to conflicting information, so a school must resolve all conflicting information before dispersing federal financial aid. So during the verification section, I like to refer to financial aid offices as stewards of financial aid programs. So they need to make sure that only eligible students are receiving those funds, right? So schools, they have their own internal systems to identify any conflicting information that may impact the student's eligibility. Um, Whether they have other offices on campus, subsequent ICERs. So once a student submits a new FAFSA, a new ICER comes up. And so if any conflicting information is noticed, the school will notify the student if any other information is required of them, any additional information or documentation, as well as the script and tax data. So while I'm not a tax expert, you may be in your field where you may see a tax form that's rather unfortunate, but just straight up erroneous in the way it was submitted, whether you're a two-parent household and they both claim the head of household, those types of things we see is most common, especially with mixed status families. And oftentimes with that, they have to get that issue fixed. And if they go through the FAFSA completing that, an institution will see that and will know like, hey, this is not right. You need to go and fix that. Otherwise, we can't award you financial aid. So I tell that to families all the time. And while in many cases they may have done it themselves by accident or on purpose or worked with a tax professional that they may have done it and not been fully aware that the tax preparer was doing that. So what I tell families oftentimes is that you may get selected for verification, and when you do, you just want to have documentation prepared to help get you through that process. Otherwise, students, you will get stuck and you're not going to receive financial aid if you don't get through verification. So speaking of which, let's go in and take a deeper dive with verification. So some updates for this year. I wanted to include some information, some changes. So there are no real changes about what information is considered acceptable documentation, with the exception that FAFSA is no longer verifying the number enrolled in college because that no longer is going to impact federal student aid. It could impact institutional aid, which is why it's still on the FAFSA, but it's not going to impact federal student aid anymore. So that's one of the bigger updates that I can think of off the top of my head, but for the most part, it is the same. FAFSA has also FSA has also indicated that they are significantly reducing verification this year. That's something to kind of keep in mind with that. They made an announcement in February 2024, which they indicated that they're going to significantly reduce verification requirements while focusing on those that impact identity fraud. So in the past years, the department has selected a larger portion of FAFSA applicants to require. But as of this year, they're going to go back to their models that they were pushing a couple years before the pandemic, which will only focus on students who are manually entering tax information or any discrepant data that's pulled from the FAFSA processing system, the FPS, so things like that. And so contributors who have their tax pulled from the IRS are not going to be required to have their tax information verified because, again, that came directly from the IRS. But then if you're looking at this, students who are manually inputting their tax information, they will definitely get verified. I will say that if you're working with students who are unable to use a direct data exchange, just have them work with them to request a tax return transcript, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation, just as best practice so that they can be prepared with that. Now, keep in mind, if they're eligible to use it, but for some reason it's not working for them, or the IRS is going through an update in their system, which when that happens, the consent to use the DDX is unavailable, they can always go back into their FAFSA once it's processed and click consent, and it'll override the data that they manually entered. So there are four purposes to verification. First is student eligibility. This is going to prevent ineligible students from receiving financial aid and ensuring that only eligible students receive what they're eligible for. Then you have a regulatory requirement. So federal student aid and ISAC require colleges and universities to check the accuracy of the information that they've submitted on the FAFSA. So if the FAFSA processing system says like, hey, you have to verify this student, they have to do so. Now, institutions also have their own accountability systems, their internal systems. So if they wanted to verify additional students, they could. As I mentioned earlier, they got to check this information to make sure it's accurate. And because they're stewards of financial aid, they need to make sure, otherwise they're going to be on the hook and have to return those funds, right? So when schools, when I tell students all the time, so if an institution is following up with you when they're verifying that information, they're not picking on you. They are just following any rules and regulations already set into place. You were just happened to be the one selected. I know I was selected every 4 years. I have some of my colleagues who've also been selected as well. So there's some common reasons. You didn't use a direct data exchange, random selection, any data inconsistencies, as well as school criteria. Now, in terms of random selection, we used to have like a percentage that was unknown, but kind of known from FSA, which they indicated that, hey, this is what we think how many FAFSAs are being verified. They had the number at 15%, which I know when I started working in financial aid almost 10 years ago, it was about a third. So they've reduced that by half. So right now they're going back to verification. So we won't know those numbers until maybe a year from now. They kind of see exactly where they're going and how they're utilizing their learning model, their AI to kind of make sure that they are not causing a huge burden on students. Because if you think about who's likely being selected for verification, that's impacting the lower income students who are eligible for the Pell Grant and all the other need-based aid programs. So here's a list of the verification items. So for those who have attended our webinars in the past, it has decreased a little bit. So verifying family size, income information, non-tax filers, as well as identity and statement of educational purpose. So when it comes to examples of acceptable documentation for family size, they can submit a signed statement with the name and age of each household member and their relationship to the applicant. And for a student who's submitting an identity and statement of educational purpose, they need to have a signed statement certifying that the federal student aid received is only used for educational purposes, as well as when they do so, they need to get it notarized if they're not in the presence of someone from the institution, but they usually have to sign it in front of them with an unexpired government ID indicating that they say who they say they are. Keep in mind, I have not personally worked with a student who has had to go through this piece of verification for identity and statement of educational purpose. FSA has stated that this is typically for students who is at risk of, dropping out early. Maybe they've already done so already because what they want to avoid is a student is just enrolling in school, getting financial aid, then dropping out and not using that money for school. And then we have income information. So we have the tax return transcript, as well as a tax return and tax account transcript. So for tax account transcript, the main difference between the two, and both of those they're both free to obtain from the IRS. They both contain basic tax information. The big difference is that the tax account transcripts includes information on amended returns, so it has the old and the new information. Students, FSA did mention the students can still submit a signed copy of their tax return. What we don't want is for students, unless they want to request a copy of their tax return because that costs $50 and that includes their full return, all the schedules that they submitted it with. And then for non-tax filers, keep in mind, if they use the direct data exchange, that's already taken care of. But for those that are manually entering information, they don't have any tax information to report, they can still report any income earned from their W-2s, or they can sign a statement certifying that they either weren't required to file with the IRS or didn't file with the IRS, and any sources of income provided on the FAFSA are accurate. But keep in mind, so again, somebody using the direct data exchange, then they're not going to be submitting a verification of non-filing anymore. So that reference has been removed. So IRS tax transcript. So I mentioned there were two: tax return and tax account. Tax return is the most common one requested. If you haven't seen one before, I would suggest you just submit one for yourself. See what it looks like. The tax account transcript, again, is usually for those who just have an amended tax return. So you want to make sure that if you're working with families and they made an amendment, to ensure that they're requesting the tax account transcript, because if they request the tax return transcript, it's just going to have the old information, not the new information. Both are free and can be requested online by phone or by mail. If they do so online, which is provides the quickest way of accessing their their tax return transcript, they'll have to answer some questions that financial questions that maybe only the person may answer. So if a student's trying to do that for the parent, they may not know some of those questions. So students and parents who manually enter their information will likely be verified and will need a tax return transcript. Just something to keep in mind. So when it comes to requesting them, as I mentioned, it can be requested online, by phone, or by mail. Um, so if they request it online, I have the website on here, I have the phone number on here. If they request it by mail or phone, it's going to take 5 to 10 business days. But if they request one online, it's going to be immediate. So they're going to need their social security number, the date of birth, access to an email account, and personal account numbers and phone numbers associated with the person's name. I think about that if you ever remember with a student's family member creating an FSA ID and they were undocumented, they had to go through the TransUnion questions. So those questions are very similar to that. We're just trying to figure out is this person who they say they are. Well, they may ask some financial questions like if they had a mortgage, what company they have that mortgage with, or if they had a car notes, what was the company they had that car note on there, what vehicles did they own in the past, what addresses did they live in the past, that sort of thing. Next, I do want to go into professional judgment. Just seeing some questions come in, so thank you um, for those questions. So, professional judgment is the authority of a school's financial aid administrator, FAA, to make an adjustment on any of the data elements in the cost of attendance or the SAI calculation to adjust a student's dependency status. So, there's two definitions of special and unusual circumstances. So, it's going to allow financial aid administrators to make adjustments to the data elements reported on the FAFSA. They make changes to the formula, right? That's a federal formula. They can't make any changes to that, but they can make changes to the information that gets inputted for the calculation, right? And these are done on a case-by-case basis. And it's at the discretion of the institution and the financial aid office, right? So what I tell students all the time that schools just can't feel sorry for the student. They have to have supporting documentation. So when they verify the student, they want supporting documentation is what they're referring to. Because institutions can get audited and they want to make sure that they have all their T's crossed and their I's dotted. So, the authority of a financial aid administrator, they can make changes to the specific data elements that go into the calculation, but not the formula tables themselves. And any adjustments to their any dependency overrides or those adjustments need to be related to the student's circumstance, right? They can't go in and just do whatever they like, right? They have to have a situation. Institutions have to follow their own rules and regulations, and so have to follow rules and regulations of federal financial aid and ISAC as well, and to make sure they're applying it consistently. So if a new SAI is generated, then the student is now, if the student wasn't eligible for MAP and Pell, but now they are, so they have to apply it across the board. So a couple updates on professional judgment policies. So there are two categories for professional judgment. You have special circumstances and unusual circumstances. So special circumstances, think about those adjusting any data elements to the cost of attendance in the FAFSA that can impact the student's SAI calculation. And think about unusual circumstances as adjusting a student's dependency status based off a unique situation. So I'll go over some examples in the next coming slides. What's also new is that schools can no longer maintain a policy of denying all professional judgment requests. They can still deny them, but now they have to have policies in place, examples of professional judgment. They can just go on and say, I'm not going to hear your professional judgment. We don't do that here, right? They have to have some kind of policy in place now. So some institutional rules and regulation updates. So they have new requirements starting this year for processing and communicating with students. So institutions must post information on their website about how to make a professional judgment request, notify students of their process requirements and timelines. And so students who've obtained an adjustment, they're going to be presumed independent for each subsequent award year at the same institution. And also institutions, if the student is transferring, that new institution can look at the old override or professional judgment and carry that forward. They don't have to go through the whole process again. Here are some examples of special circumstances: a loss of income, change in marital status, medical expenses, death of a parent. I've also included some supporting documentation of that. So loss of income, a student could submit a layoff notice. A change in marital status, students can submit a marriage certificate or divorce decree, etc. And then with unusual circumstances, so these are for an example of student leaving an abusive home environment. Student doesn't know where their parents are, has no contact with them. The parents are incarcerated. So for example, student may have to submit written statements, may have letters of support, this process can be rather intrusive. This is essentially what leads to a dependency override, because again, what's happening is students who are under the age of 24, if they can't answer yes to any dependency questions, are considered a dependent student, have to provide information on their parents, because if they don't, they're not going to receive a student aid index. They're not going to know what they're eligible for. And so they have to go through this process if they think they're eligible for an unusual circumstance for a dependency override, so that they can be considered an independent student and not have to provide parental information. Some examples of non-unusual circumstances, so reasons that don't qualify as an unusual circumstance or a special circumstance. So you have parents unwilling to provide information of the FAFSA, parents refusing to pay for the cost of college, student is financially dependent or physically independent from their parents. Even if the student owns their own home or doesn't live with them, if they're under the age of 24 and they can't answer yes to any of those questions, they have to provide information on their parents. Well, it's very rare. We've seen some instances like that. The last example I gave, but I tell family members all the time, students and families, if you're under the age of 24, you can't answer yes to these questions, be expected to provide parental information. And for financial aid appeals, so if a student receiving their financial aid offer isn't enough to meet the student's need, they may submit an appeal. There are various reasons for an appeal. It could be for a professional judgment request. Maybe there's a change in the student's, or another institution's offering more aid, a similar institution. The student really wants to go to the institution they've applied to, but they want to receive a little bit more financial aid. They can see what happens. But students cannot make any appeals to the Department of Education or the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. It's handled at the school. They may have to be required to submit other documentation or forms for that. So other reasons for appeals, as I mentioned, they weren't offered the aid they were eligible for. A student may have been offered more aid at a similar institution. Maybe they didn't meet satisfactory academic progress. So what happens if you don't meet SAP? You have to get your GPA back up at a certain level defined by the institution, typically a 2.0, but it's defined by the institution to get your grades up, and then you can start receiving access to financial aid. Now, institutions are not required to accept the appeal, even if another institution grants one. But keep in mind, especially with professional judgment, institutions can do that. They have the power to do that if they don't want to go through the whole process themselves. But institutions handle their own processes differently. They have their own versions or supporting documentation examples. So it's important to always reach out to the institution to see what information is exactly needed from them. Because when they get selected for verification, it's important that students only submit information that's being requested of them, and they don't submit any additional information or as just in case. Because when they do that, institutions are required to review that information. So we do have a resource for students to utilize in helping them in their appeals process. So Swift Student is a free digital resource that provides financial aid appeal letter templates for students seeking professional judgments. Students can learn about the financial aid process. They can review eligibility requirements for making an appeal. They can review all the different letter templates. All they have to do is enter some basic information and a letter will get generated for them. And as with any appeal or request, the approval is going to depend on the discretion of the financial aid administrator. Don't have any data suggesting that this appeal significantly increases students' likelihood of being accepted. We don't have any of that kind of information because that's on the institution. But we will say that this is a great resource to help students at least not use like, well, I don't know what to do as sort of a burden. So if you're working with students, creating this letter, I think, empowers the student, because makes them a little bit more familiar with the process and build some advocacy skills on their behalf. So I want to go over some resources, but this pretty much does it for the content of this presentation. First thing I want to highlight is the FSA Partners 2425 FAFSA Issues Alert. I was literally having a conversation with my colleagues. It's kind of impossible to keep track of all of the updates and workarounds and open issues on there. So this has all that information on this website. You can look by FAFSA form, by ICERs, and anything that's been resolved, anything that's still open. So if you see something, you're just like, what is going on? Is it me? Is it my computer? In some cases, it's just a glitch in the system, right? And students and parents, I've seen a tremendous amount of resilience, and I tell them all the time, especially right now, it's not you, right? It's the FAFSA, right? So they're still going there. They've had a huge rollout, and they just had tons of issues happening this year. And some things we've seen, especially throughout the year, some things that weren't an issue in the beginning and are becoming an issue. And so something like that is all on this website, so it's very easy for you to keep tab on. And also, we have a free FAFSA communication toolkit from ISAC. So if you're looking to host more workshops, especially engage students over the spring before they graduate, or especially through the summer, to help avoid summer melt, these are some of the things that you can utilize that are completely free. And I have the link on here as well where you can access that. We've also made updates to our financial aid application completion initiative tool. So this is available for high schools to keep track of FAFSA, alternative applications, and opt-out waiver completions in our gift assistance program or GAP Access. So colleges use GAP Access to ensure that eligible students are receiving MAP, do payment claims, and so forth. But this is available only for high schools. So they can also use and print the roster at the end of the year for compliance for the financial aid application graduation requirement. Because as we know that it is a requirement for students to either submit a FAFSA alternative application or an opt-out waiver in order to graduate. But if you're on the high school side, and you're noticing a student hasn't done the opt-out waiver, you haven't been able to get a hold of them, and you can simply go in. This is a new feature that we've announced late last week. You can go in and click on an admin waiver FAFSA requirement. So, or once you click on that, it's going to automatically check that student through, and you won't have to worry about them not graduating. And then that individual, that person who has that admin control of the account, or any administrators who have access to GAP Access, don't have to include any additional information, such as what were some of the things that you did to outreach the student, that sort of justification piece. You just have to check that box, and that's going to go through. And also, next week is our PACE Symposium. Registration is still open for May 8th at Elgin Community College. So if you're interested, you have the QR code there. Keep it open for just a few seconds for those who are interested in attending. And also we have our website, and you can always go to isac.org/PACE, and we have some more information on that where you can get Eventbrite access to it. And then we also have our half-day PACE training part 2. Registration is open. It's going to be at Lincoln Land Community College from Thursday, May 9th, 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. And so we're going to be focusing on data, building capacity. So especially if you've attended part 1, this is the second version of that. Leave that open for a few seconds. And we have information on our first generation scholars, so students who are first in their family to go to college. We have some additional resources available for them specifically for being first gen. So services are available at no cost. You can join that network and receive additional information and invites to events happening throughout the state. And then we have a PACE framework survey. So help us take an inventory of what's happening at your school or district. You have until the end of May. So I'll keep this QR code open. And if you would like to complete the survey, you can always reach out to us and we can send you the link to the survey. And lastly, for those who are requesting CEs and PDs, you have until 4/30th on Thursday to collect them. My colleague is going to open them up on the chat where you can have access to the survey. So that's up. Thank you, Tommy. So again, if you're requesting PD hours, we ask that you please submit your EIN so that we can process that and have no hiccups on that. So you'll see that on the chat. And lastly, because I know we got 1 minute left, I also want to announce that we're here to help. Any questions that you may have, we're here live. We work from 8 to 4, 8 to 5. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. We're also announcing a new ISAC texting service specifically just for professionals. I know we've had this and talked about it for students, and then we've had one for parents, for Spanish speakers. Now we have one for professionals, right? For anyone who works in college access, middle school practitioners, high school practitioners, call our ISAC Connection. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to us at 847-250-2384. You can have a real person, one of us, respond to your text message. And we want to ensure that we're here and available, especially throughout this, really bumpy FAFSA application cycle. So you can always reach out to us at isaac.outreach training@illinois.gov, but you can also text us now. And so for any more information, we have our website, isaac.org/PD. And if you're not signed up for e-messaging, we encourage you to sign up for ISAC e-messaging so you can get all the latest updates on any trainings and any updates that are happening at the state level that impact financial aid. So that's all we have today. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good rest of your day. And again, if you have any questions, reach out to us at isaac.outreachtraining@illinois.gov. Thank you.